She thought betrayal would come from strangers, but never from the two people she trusted most. When Clara Whitmore opened a door one night, she found her husband and her own mother together, shattering the very ground beneath her feet. At the next family gathering, the table looked perfect, candles, roast, laughter rehearsed. But Clara carried a secret ledger, and with it, the truth. What happens when silence becomes louder than shouting? When a child's innocent drawing exposes what adults try to hide? Would you have stayed at that table or walked out forever? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic, the slow simmer of chicken broth filling the air with a warmth that should have felt comforting. Clara Whitmore moved with practiced ease, sliding the wooden spoon around the pot, her hands steady even though her thoughts were not. Daniel was late again. He had been laid off in these past few weeks, each excuse sounding like the last. Traffic, a call that ran longer, a stop at the store he forgot to mention. She told herself not to notice, but silence pressed into the corners of the house, heavy and waiting, as if it wanted her to. She set the spoon down and adjusted the flame, listening to the sound of Amelia's laughter trickle in faintly from the living room, where cartoons played too loudly. Their daughter's voice was the only thread that kept Clara anchored when the space between her and Daniel felt like it was growing wider by the day. She wiped her hands on a towel, lined up plates on the counter, white ceramic with faint blue rims, the same set they had chosen together when they first married. She wondered if he even remembered that day anymore, the long aisles of the department store, the way he made a joke about picking the sturdiest plates in case they fought and needed to throw them. The sound came suddenly. 3 firm knocks at the door. Not hurried, not timid, measured. Clara froze, her hand still resting on the folded towel. Few people came by unannounced. The neighborhood kept to itself, and evenings belonged to families. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its brass frame reflecting the light from the kitchen. Almost 7. Daniel should have been walking in by now, loosening his tie, setting down his briefcase. But instead, it was someone else at the door. She walked through the narrow hallway, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. The knocks didn't come again, but their echo lingered, carrying with it a weight that pressed against her chest. Through the frosted glass pane, she could make out the shape of a person, blurred but waiting. She reached for the knob, hesitated, and then turned it. The door opened with a quiet creak that always reminded her she needed to oil the hinges. On the porch stood a neighbor, Mr. Lawson from across the street, his shoulders stooped beneath his brown coat. He tipped his cap, eyes darting past Clara into the house as though reluctant to meet her gaze. "Evening, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, voice low, carrying the rough edge of someone unsure if he should come at all. "Hate to trouble you." Clara forced a smile, polite but thin. "It's no trouble at all. Is something wrong?" He shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the wooden boards. "Saw Daniel's car earlier, down by the old pharmacy lot." He stopped, cleared his throat. "Thought, maybe you ought to know, in case he's delayed." Her pulse quickened, though her face remained calm. She thanked him, closed the door gently, and stood still in the dim hallway. Behind her, the broth continued to simmer. Amelia's laughter rose with the cartoon voices, and yet the air felt altered, charged with something she couldn't yet name. Clara pressed her hand against the wood of the door as though steadying herself against the tide. Dinner waited, her daughter waited, and somewhere out in town, Daniel lingered in ways he hadn't explained. The knock had changed nothing and everything all at once. The broth continued to murmur in the kitchen as Clara slipped on her sweater and stepped out onto the porch. The evening had settled heavy over the neighborhood, sky painted in streaks of gray and violet, the first porch lights flickering on like tired sentinels. The air was cooler than she expected, the kind of autumn chill that worked its way beneath fabric and into the bones. She folded her arms across her chest, more out of instinct than warmth, and let her eyes roam across the quiet street. It was still, the sort of stillness that belongs to small towns after supper, when families retreat indoors and only the occasional passing car disturbs the rhythm. Yet something tugged at her, something about the way silence seemed fuller tonight, carrying more than its share weight. Clara looked toward the old maple at the edge of their yard. Its branches swayed slightly, though no wind touched her skin. The movement drew her gaze to the neighbor's drive, where shadows slipped across the pavement, too deliberate to be tricks of the fading light. Her stomach tightened. She told herself it could be anything, a cat, one of the Lawson boys cutting through the yards. But the figure was too tall, too measured. She leaned slightly against the porch railing, careful not to make the boards creak. The shape moved again, just beyond the corner of her kitchen window, gliding into a space where it shouldn't be. She knew the rhythm of her street, the way the light pulled in certain corners, the places where reflections played tricks. This was different. Clara stepped off the porch quietly, her shoes crunching against a gravel path that led to the side of the house. Each step carried her deeper into the silence, and with each step her breath seemed louder, more insistent. Her gut told her not to stop. Something was there, something waiting. She reached the side yard and paused beneath the shadow of the house. The window to the den was slightly ajar, curtain drawn, but not all the way. Light leaked through the narrow slit, the golden glow of a lamp that hadn't been on when she left the kitchen. She narrowed her eyes, straining to make sense of the shapes within. The curtain shifted, not with the breeze, but with motion inside. A figure passed. Then another. Her throat tightened as recognition began to stir, though she tried to push it back. The outline of broad shoulders, the tilt of a familiar stance. Daniel's. She had seen that posture in countless photographs, in the doorway when he came home from work, in the reflection of mirrors when he adjusted his tie. He was inside. That much she knew, but he wasn't supposed to be. The second shadow unsettled her more. Smaller yet assured, a tilt of the head, a flick of hair caught in the lamplight. The shape was unmistakably feminine. For a moment Clara thought perhaps Amelia had slipped away from her cartoons. But no, the height was wrong, the movement too practiced. This was someone else. Clara's hand gripped the window frame, her knuckles whitening against the wood. She could not hear words, only the murmur of voices, low and intimate. Her instinct screamed louder than reason. She should turn away, walk back to the kitchen, stir the broth as though nothing had pulled her from her evening. But her body remained rooted, caught between dread and confirmation. The shadows inside moved closer together. She saw Daniel lean in, saw the curtain brush against his shoulder, saw another shape tilt toward him. The air thickened in her lungs. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock inside, seemed to amplify in her ears. Clara drew back slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs, the truth pressing at the edges of her certainty. She had not seen faces, only movements, only the unmistakable familiarity of two bodies in a room where there should have been none. But her gut, sharpened by years of reading silences and unspoken truths, told her everything she needed to know. She stepped back slowly, careful not to let the gravel betray her retreat. The curtain shifted once more, closing off the glimpse, leaving only the memory of what she had seen or thought she had. The night pressed heavier now, the street lamps casting long, watchful shadows across the quiet block. Clara pulled her sweater tighter, turned toward the porch, and felt the world tilt in ways that dinner plates and simmering broth could no longer balance. Something inside that house had shifted, and nothing in her life would return to its old shape. Clara's hand lingered on the porch railing, as though the grain of the wood might steady her. She could still see those shifting shadows in her mind, the way Daniel's form leaned in, the second silhouette tilting toward him. Her body moved before her thoughts caught up, carrying her along the side of the house toward the back. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and cooling earth, a smell she had always loved, but now it clung to her like something heavy. She walked carefully, each step slow, her shoes finding the softer ground where they wouldn't crunch against the gravel. The back door was always locked. Daniel had a habit of checking it twice before bed, his way of assuring himself that order remained intact, that the house was closed off to the night. But as Clara reached the handle, her fingers brushed metal that yielded too easily. It turned beneath her touch with no resistance. She froze, the silence around her humming. Daniel would never have left it unlocked. That detail settled into her chest like a stone. She pressed gently, and the door creaked open, a long, tired sound that seemed too loud and quiet. She winced at it, waiting for someone inside to react, but no one came. Instead, hushed voices drifted toward her. They were low, urgent, threaded with familiarity that pierced deeper than the words themselves. She didn't catch sentences, only the rhythm, but she knew them both. Daniel's baritone, softened by closeness, and another voice she knew as intimately as her own heartbeat, her mother's. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to tell herself she was wrong, that the shadows at the window had tricked her, that her ears deceived her now. But denial weakened with each passing second as Evelyn's laugh floated to the gap, hushed but undeniable. It was a laugh Clara had grown up with, a sound that filled birthdays, family dinners, and late-night talks over cups of tea. A laugh that now came from inside her house, woven too closely with her husband's voice. Her hand stayed on the doorframe, pressing into the wood until her fingertips hurt. The voices grew clearer. Daniel said something she couldn't fully hear, his tone playful, conspiratorial, stripped of the weight he carried at home. Evelyn replied in a whisper, her words blurred but her cadence unmistakable. Then came silence. Silence broken only by the sound of fabric brushing against fabric, a small thud like a chair nudged across the floor. Clara's heart pounded so hard she thought it might give her away. She edged inside, her steps deliberate, careful not to betray her presence. The back room was dim, lit only by a lamp in the corner that cast its glow through the half-closed door leading into the den. She stood in the shadows, her body taut, listening as the murmurs resumed. Words were clearer now, too clear. Daniel's voice lowered into something almost tender. Evelyn responded with a sigh that carried warmth, the kind of warmth a daughter should never hear from her mother when speaking to her husband. Clara's stomach turned, but she didn't move. She couldn't. The truth was pressing down on her, heavy, undeniable. Each second that passed in that half-lit room carved the betrayal deeper, stripping away excuses she might have clung to. She felt herself fracture. One part wanted to storm to the door and shatter whatever intimacy hung in the air. Another part frozen in a quiet terror that as she saw too much, she would never be able to look away. A floorboard creaked from the den. Daniel's laugh, low and soft, followed by Evelyn's murmured response. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, not to stifle a scream, but to keep the breath from leaving her lungs too loudly. The unlocked door, the shadows, the voices she knew too well. Everything had aligned into a truth that no ledger could erase, no silence could soften. She stepped back slowly, her body trembling with the effort to remain quiet. The chicken broth still simmered in the kitchen. Amelia's cartoon still played in the front room, and yet the world had tilted into something unrecognizable. She stood in the back room, staring at the narrow door that separated her from Daniel and Evelyn, her mother and her husband bound in a betrayal so intimate it hollowed the house around her. Clara did not move forward. She did not confront. Not yet. She let the door remain cracked. The voices seeped through, and the weight of what she now knew settled into her bones. Clara's hand trembled against the frame of the half-open door, the muted lamplight from the den spilling across the back room floor. The voices had quieted into whispers, broken by short bursts of laughter that struck her like knives. She leaned closer, her breath shallow, the faint scent of chicken broth from the kitchen still clinging to her clothes, absurdly at odds with the sour taste of dread in her mouth. Her gut begged her to step away, to retreat before seeing what could never be unseen. But something stronger, a mixture of instinct, suspicion, and the cruel need for certainty, pulled her forward. The door moved beneath her touch, creaking softly as she inched it wider. She winced at the sound, but the laughter inside drowned it. Through the widening gap, she saw them. Daniel sat on the old armchair angled toward the window, his tie loosened, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked younger somehow, lighter, as if the strain he carried home each evening had been lifted away in this room. Evelyn was perched on the arm of the chair, her hand draped across his shoulder, fingers curling against the fabric in a way that spoke not of family, but of intimacy. Her face was tilted toward his, her smile lingering, her lips dangerously close to his cheek. Clara froze. The scene held her in place, every detail etching itself into memory. Daniel's hand rested casually on Evelyn's thigh, not in hesitation, but with the confidence of habit. The distance between them was gone, replaced by a familiarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Evelyn's laugh, Clara's mother's laugh, the sound of her childhood, slipped into the air, hushed now, almost secretive. It carried warmth, but not the warmth of a grandmother sitting with her granddaughter, not the warmth of family. It was the warmth of possession, of stolen closeness. Her stomach twisted. For a fleeting moment, she hoped it was some cruel misunderstanding, a gesture misread, an innocent closeness magnified by her own fear. But then Daniel turned his face toward Evelyn's, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not hurried or stolen. It was deliberate, unashamed, as if both had rehearsed this betrayal in silences she had mistaken for ordinary life. Clara's knees weakened, her hand gripping the doorframe so hard the wood pressed deep into her palm. Time splintered. She thought of birthdays Evelyn had baked cakes for, of holidays where Daniel carved the roast while Evelyn poured the wine. She thought of Amelia, her laughter echoing in the living room only a wall away, oblivious to how her family was collapsing in the next room. Clara felt herself split open, her trust unraveling thread by thread, until she was left staring at the two people who had once anchored her life and now sat together like strangers bound in betrayal. The room itself betrayed her too. The familiar quilt folded over the back of the chair, the faint hum of the old clock on the shelf, the framed photograph of Amelia taken last spring still standing on the table beside them. All of it made the scene more obscene, as if the ordinary trappings of family had become props in a cruel performance staged for her discovery. Clara did not cry. The tears burned but did not fall. Instead, she felt an uncanny stillness settle over her, a coldness that steadied her even as her heart raced. She pushed the door open fully now, and the sound was enough. Daniel's head jerked up, Evelyn's smile vanished, and for a moment the three of them were locked in silence. Evelyn's hand slipped from his shoulder. Daniel's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. Clara stood in the doorway, her body rigid, her eyes unblinking. The truth had been suspicion a moment before. Now it was undeniable, visible, undeniable in the air between them. She did not shout. She did not curse. Her silence filled the room heavier than any outburst could. Daniel shifted uneasily in the chair. Evelyn's face paled, and still Clara said nothing. The betrayal no longer whispered in shadows. It had stepped fully into the light, and there would be no hiding from it again. Daniel was the first to move. He sprang from the chair as though burned, his hand jerking away from Evelyn's leg, his mouth stumbling open in a desperate search for words that would not come. Evelyn shifted too, standing quickly, smoothing her blouse with trembling fingers as if straightening fabric could erase what Clara had seen. Both of them scrambled like guilty children caught in the act, though no child could have matched the weight of this betrayal. They spoke over one another first, voices colliding, excuses forming too fast to be believed. "Clara, wait," Daniel stammered, his hands half raised, palms open, like a man trying to calm a storm. "It isn't what it looks like," Evelyn added quickly, her tone brittle, cracking beneath its own lie. Clara stood in the doorway and let them flounder. She did not answer. She did not scream or demand explanations. Her silence pressed down on the room, suffocating, heavier than if she had hurled every plate in the house. The stillness stretched, punctuated only by the nervous shuffle of their feet and the faint tick of the old clock on the shelf. Daniel tried again, his voice urgent now, pleading, "Please, Clara, just let me explain. It's not." But the words dissolved under the weight of her stare. Clara's eyes moved between them, unblinking, cold. Evelyn tried to hold her gaze, but faltered, looking down, then away, her hands clutched together in front of her like she was waiting for judgment. The air itself seemed to recoil, the lamplight too harsh, exposing every crease of shame on their faces. Clara's silence became its own language. She didn't need to ask questions. She had already seen enough. The absence of her voice left them scrambling harder, their excuses tangling and collapsing. They were desperate to fill the void she left, as though noise could undo what had been laid bare. Evelyn stepped forward slightly, her words trembling. "Clara, listen to me. This was a mistake. You weren't supposed to—" She stopped herself, realizing too late that even her choice of words condemned her. Weren't supposed to, not supposed to be caught. Clara's jaw tightened. but still she did not speak. Daniel reached toward her then, his hand hovering as if to touch her arm, but he stopped short. The space between them felt like an ocean, and he was drowning on the wrong shore. He ran a hand through his hair, muttering half-sentences. It happened. I didn't... Clara, I love you. You have to know that. I love you. The words rang hollow, stripped of weight by the evidence she had witnessed. Love did not sit in armchairs with her mother, whispering in the dark. Love did not kiss when the wife's back was turned. Clara's silence made the word echo louder than if she had shouted at him for daring to use it. She took a step into the room, and both Daniel and Evelyn shifted nervously, as if her quiet presence carried more danger than fury ever could. She walked past them without glancing at their hands, their faces, the space they had shared. Each step seemed to hammer judgment into the floor. She reached for the photograph on the table, the one of Amelia with her gap-toothed smile, taken in spring when the world still felt whole. Clara lifted it gently, held it against her chest, and turned back toward the doorway. Daniel's voice cracked as he called after her. Clara, please, say something, please. But she didn't. She walked out, her silence the sharpest blade she possessed, leaving them in the wreckage of their own making. The den behind her was filled with the sound of two people trying to breathe in air that had turned too heavy to inhale. Clara's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, though she didn't notice until the leather squeaked beneath her palms. The engine hummed low, steady, and indifferent, carrying her forward even as her thoughts spiraled backward. She had left the house without deciding where she meant to go, only knowing she had to leave, that the walls of that place were no longer hers. The kitchen with its simmering broth, the living room with Amelia's laughter, the den with its shadows, all of it had collapsed into a space she could not breathe in. The night pressed close around the car as she rolled through the streets of town. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light on the pavement, halos that appeared and vanished as she passed beneath them. Shop fronts were dark, blinds drawn against the evening, though their faded signs still clung stubbornly to the windows. The florist with its painted tulips, the hardware store with sale banner that had hung since spring, the barber with its striped pole dimmed for the night. She knew every storefront, every crack in the sidewalks, but tonight they felt foreign and distant, as though she were driving through someone else's town. She slowed at a stoplight, though no other cars idled there. The red glow bathed the dashboard, and in that glow she saw her wedding ring glint faintly. She stared at it, that narrow band that had once promised forever, and her stomach twisted. She wanted to slide it off, throw it on the passenger seat, but her fingers remained still on the wheel. The ring burned against her skin, not from weight but from memory, his vows, her mother's proud smile at the ceremony, Amelia's small hands tugging at it when she was a baby. Now the ring was nothing but a lie etched in gold. The light turned green. Clara didn't notice until the car behind her honked, startling her forward. She pressed the gas and let the road stretch out again, though she had no destination. Past the library with its locked doors, past the church with its steeple pointing at a sky that offered no answers. Her reflection flickered in the glass of each darkened window, pale, unrecognizable, a woman hollowed by what she had seen. At the edge of town, the neon glow of Fern's diner cut through the darkness. Its sign buzzed faintly, half the letters flickering, but the windows shone warm. Inside, a handful of late customers hunched over coffee cups, their faces weary but ordinary. Clara slowed as she passed, her eyes drawn to the simple scene. She could almost hear the scrape of forks, the murmur of conversation, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Life went on in there, steady and mundane. None of them knew that not far away, in a quiet house, a family had torn itself apart in a single breath. She kept driving, past a diner, past a gas station where a lone attendant leaned against the counter beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. The streets blurred, and she drove them again as if circling would bring clarity. But each turn only carried her deeper into her own thoughts. She saw Daniel's hand on Evelyn's thigh, the way they had leaned toward each other, the kiss that had sealed everything. The image replayed relentlessly, sharper each time, until she wanted to tear it from her mind with her own hands. Finally, she pulled into an empty parking lot behind the old pharmacy, the same one Lawson had mentioned earlier. The building loomed dark, its windows covered in dust, its sign barely hanging. She killed the engine, and silence roared in its place. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel, her breath shallow, and let the night close in. There were no answers here, no comfort, only the knowledge that her life had been split into two halves, the before and the after. And the after stretched ahead of her like this road, endless and uncertain, with no clear way home. When Clara finally returned to the house, the broth had gone still on the stove, a thin film gathering on the surface. The scent of garlic and rosemary lingered, stubborn and unchanged, as though the evening had been ordinary. Amelia's toys were scattered across the rug where she had left them, her crayons rolling beneath the coffee table, her small blanket crumpled in a corner. Everything looked untouched, yet nothing felt the same. Clara moved through the rooms as though walking through a museum of her own life, careful not to disturb the artifacts, unwilling to let the silence fracture any further. She entered the kitchen and pulled out the chair at the small oak table. It was the chair she had always taken at breakfast, angled slightly toward the window where morning light would filter in. The wood creaked softly beneath her weight, a familiar sound that carried her back to countless mornings of coffee and toast. Daniel's newspaper spread wide, Amelia's chatter filling the air. Now the chair felt heavier, as though it understood what she carried with her. From the drawer beside the fridge, she drew out the ledger. It was a plain notebook, bound in brown leather with its corners worn soft from years of use. She had started keeping it early in their marriage, at first jotting down recipes she wanted to remember, later adding notes of birthdays, dentist appointments, and small purchases. Over time, it becomes something else, an unspoken diary, not of feelings but of facts, a quiet record of days that mattered, whether joyful or otherwise. She laid it on the table and opened to a blank page. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink. Her hand hesitated over the date, the pen hovering as though reluctant to mark what could never be erased. Slowly she pressed the nib to the paper and wrote the numbers, the day, the month, the year. She paused, staring at the digits until they blurred. The ledger had carried anniversaries and Amelia's first words. Now it would carry this. Her handwriting remained steady as she wrote the names. Daniel Whitmore, Evelyn Grant. She did not elaborate. She did not write what she had seen, or how her stomach had clenched, or how the room had spun. She only wrote the truth in the simplest form, a truth that no one could argue with. The pen scratched quietly, each stroke heavy with meaning. She closed her eyes and let her fingers rest on the page. It felt final, heavier than any argument, louder than any accusation. The act of writing had carved the betrayal into permanence, ensuring that even if she doubted her own memory one day, she could return to these words. The ledger would not lie. Clara had turned the page back to earlier entries, her mother's birthday last spring, Daniel's business trip in July, Amelia's school recital in September. The handwriting was the same, but the woman who had written those notes was not the same as the one who sat here now. That woman had believed in order, in continuity, in days marked down like beads on string. Tonight the string had snapped, scattering the beads, leaving only sharp edges to gather. She set the pen aside and closed the ledger with a soft thud. Her palm rested on the cover, grounding herself in the solidity of leather and paper. Outside, the night hummed with crickets, oblivious. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet, except for Amelia's gentle breathing drifting from her room down the hall. Clara let that sound hold her for a moment, the reminder that one part of her world remained untouched, innocent, and whole. She slid the ledger back into the drawer and shut it carefully. No one else would know it was there, not Daniel, not Evelyn. It was her secret record, her own testimony. She rose from the chair, extinguished the stove flame, and stood in the dark kitchen with the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the space. The entry sat behind her in the drawer, quiet but immovable, anchoring her to the reality of what she had seen. Morning came as though nothing had changed. Sunlight pressed through the curtains, soft and golden, catching on the edges of the cereal bowl Clara set in front of Amelia. Her daughter's laughter, bright and unknowing, filled the kitchen as she recited a silly rhyme she had learned at school. Clara smiled when Amelia looked up at her, because that was what was expected, because she could not let the child sense the fracture that had opened beneath them all. But every sound, every movement carried a new heaviness. Evelyn arrived mid-morning, letting herself in as she always had. She swept into the house with practiced ease, carrying a tin of cookies and a bright smile, her voice pitched just a little too high. Amelia squealed and ran to her grandmother, wrapping small arms around her waist, and Evelyn bent down to hug her with the warmth of a woman who had raised children of her own. Clara stood at the sink, hands in the dishwater, her back rigid. She could hear their voices behind her, could picture Amelia tugging Evelyn's hand toward the living room where dolls and puzzles waited. It had once been a scene that comforted her, a reminder of bonds spanning generations. Now it felt suffocating, poisoned by what she knew. Every laugh, every affectionate gesture carried a second meaning that pressed against Clara's ribs like a blade. She dried her hands slowly, turned, and forced herself to watch them together. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward her just once, quick, unreadable, before she looked back to Amelia. There was no apology in that glance, no shame, only a fleeting acknowledgement, as though the betrayal were a private word spoken between them that could never be repeated aloud. Clara's throat tightened. At lunch, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He carried a bag of groceries in one hand, the newspaper under the other, whistling as he stepped inside. He kissed Amelia on the forehead, clapped Evelyn lightly on the shoulder, then turned toward Clara with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. They sat together at the table, bowls of soup before them, the same table where Clara had once felt safe. Daniel laughed at Amelia's stories, loud and hearty, the kind of laugh that used to warm her, but now it rang hollow, a sound twisted into mockery, because he could see how easily it slipped from his mouth, how seamlessly he could play the part of devoted husband and son-in-law when the truth was still smoldering in the corners of the house. Evelyn added to the conversation, teasing Daniel about his poor memory, telling Amelia a story about her mother when she was a child. Daniel's eyes crinkled at the edges as he chuckled. Evelyn's hand brushed the table near his, and Clara felt her stomach knot. These were the same gestures she had once cherished, the small interactions that defined family. Now they felt staged, contaminated, each moment threaded with secrets only the three adults in the room carried. Amelia, innocent and laughing, became the only true thing left at that table. Clara kept her silence. She spooned her soup, nodded when appropriate, smiled for her daughter's sake. But inside, the images twisted and tangled. Evelyn babysitting Amelia, her hands gentle as she braided the child's hair. Daniel returning home, setting his briefcase down, joining them for dinner with a kiss to Clara's cheek. Evelyn passing dishes at the holiday table. Daniel telling stories that drew laughter from everyone, all of it replayed in her mind. Scenes once treasured, now suffocating her with the knowledge that they had been acting in shadows even then. When the meal ended, Evelyn offered to take Amelia to the park. Clara agreed, though the words tasted bitter. She watched in the doorway as her daughter skipped between them, one small hand clasped in each of theirs, the image of a perfect family moment unfolding on the sidewalk. It was the kind of sight that might have warmed her heart once. Now it stole her breath, because what should have been pure love had been tainted beyond repair. She closed the door slowly, the latch clicking shut like a verdict. Alone in the quiet kitchen, she pressed her palms against the table, staring at the empty bowls and crumbs left behind. The family ties that bound her were the same ones strangling her now, and she could feel them tightening, thread by thread. The bedroom was quiet when Clara entered, the late afternoon light spilling through the curtains in pale ribbons across the bedspread. She shut the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, letting the stillness close in around her. It was the one room in the house that had always felt like hers, a place where she folded laundry in silence, where she read at night with a lamp casting a small circle of light. Now even this space felt foreign, invaded not by bodies but by memory, haunted by what she had seen. She sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at her hand. The gold band caught the last trace of sunlight, glinting as though it were proud of itself. For years it had been her anchor, a symbol of promises made in front of family and God, a circle meant to be unbroken. She remembered Daniel slipping it onto her finger on their wedding day, his hand trembling slightly with nerves, Evelyn dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief in the front pew. The moment had felt permanent then, unshakable, as though they had built something no force could undo. But permanence had proven fragile. Now the ring seemed to burn against her skin. She lifted her hand closer, turning it in the light, studying the way the band rested so neatly on her finger. She imagined sliding it off, setting it aside, leaving it behind like a shed skin. The thought both tempted and terrified her. What would it mean to take it off? What would Amelia notice if she did? Would Daniel look at her differently, or would he even care? Would Evelyn? Her thumb pressed against the band, testing it. It shifted slightly, loose enough to move if she wanted it gone. She paused there, the decision poised between one breath and next. The metal felt heavier than it should, as if all the years of marriage, all the betrayals and quiet mornings had sunk into it, weighing it down. To remove it would be to acknowledge that everything had changed, that what she saw in the den had severed the vows spoken so long ago. She lowered her hand back into her lap. The ring remained. She could not take it off. Not yet. The act felt too final, too visible, and Clara was not ready to expose the fracture to the world. Instead, she lifted her hand once more and placed it gently on the nightstand beside the bed, leaving the ring gleaming in the fading light. It looked small there, a perfect circle lying flat against the polished wood, but its presence filled the room like a weight pressing down. She stared at it, half expecting it to move, to roll, to resist being left behind. For a long time she sat there, her hand bare, the skin pale where the band had shielded it from sun and time. The mark felt like a scar, the absence of gold more present than the ring itself. She rubbed the spot absently, her chest tight, her breath shallow. The silence of the bedroom deepened, stretching out until she thought she might drown in it. Finally, she reached forward, picked up the ring again, and slid it back onto her finger. The motion was slow, reluctant, but inevitable. The band settled into place as if it had never left, as if the bare moment had been a dream. She flexed her fingers, feeling its coldness sink into her skin. She hated it, yet she could not part with it. Not yet. It remained, not as a comfort, but as a reminder, a symbol too heavy to move. Clara lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling as the shadows lengthened. The ring pressed into her finger, sharp despite its smoothness, and she let it. She would carry it a little longer. Because sometimes symbols are not shed in moments of anger, but worn until they cut deep enough to force the truth into daylight. Amelia's world remained bright and unbroken, at least on the surface. She still bounded down the hallway in her socks, hair flying behind her as she clutched her stuffed rabbit. She still tugged at Clara's sleeve, eager to share a new drawing from school or a song she had learned on the playground. The child's laughter rang through the house like bells, sharp and clear, cutting through the heaviness that pressed down on Clara's chest. And Clara, though her own world had fractured beyond repair, bent herself around that laughter, careful never to let Amelia hear the crack in her own voice. At breakfast, Clara poured milk over Amelia's cereal, listening as her daughter chattered about friends and teachers. Daniel walked in halfway through, adjusting his tie, and pressed a kiss to the top of Amelia's head. She giggled, wiping it away with a dramatic flourish, and Clara forced her mouth into a smile that felt foreign on her face. She could not let Amelia see the distance, could not let her daughter notice how Clara's eyes did not linger on Daniel, how her body stiffened when Evelyn appeared later in the doorway, offering to take Amelia to school. The family routine continued, polished and ordinary, but beneath it Clara held her breath, steadying the ground for Amelia so it would not collapse. After school, Amelia returned with paint smudge on her fingers and a story about a class project. She spread the drawing across the kitchen table. Stick figures of herself, Clara, Daniel, and Evelyn, all smiling under a sun drawn with orange streaks. Clara's throat closed at the sight. She smoothed her daughter's hair and nodded encouragement, praising the bright colors, though her eyes burned. In the drawing, Amelia's world was whole. She could not know that two of the smiles belonged to people who had stolen from the one woman who should have been safe in both their arms. At night, Clara lingered by Amelia's bed longer than usual, tucking the blanket beneath her chin, brushing her hair back with steady fingers. Amelia whispered questions about stars and fairies, about whether rabbits dreamed. Clara answered them all, her voice calm and even, though her heart twisted with the knowledge that innocence could not be protected forever. She watched her daughter's eyelids flutter closed, listened to her breathing deepen, and only then allowed the silence inside herself to spill free. When Daniel slipped into the room later, whispering his goodnights, Clara kept her distance, standing in the shadowed doorway. Amelia stirred briefly, murmured something soft, then returned to sleep. Daniel's eyes met Clara's across the room, but she turned away, her body a wall between him and the child. Evelyn's visits were worse. Clara watched from the kitchen window as her mother took Amelia's hand, leading her down the sidewalk toward the park. The child swung her arm happily, unaware of the tightening grip that coiled in Clara's stomach. She wanted to scream, to pull Amelia back, to sever that handhold forever, but she said nothing. To protect her daughter meant not tearing open the truth yet, not while the girl's world still shone intact. The house carried on with its routines, the bedtime stories, the dinners, the homework spread across the table. Clara poured herself into every detail of Amelia's care, making sure her laughter never faltered, her sense of safety never cracked. It was a fragile balance, like patching a roof with thin cloth. But Clara bore it. She would hold the storm off a little longer. Her daughter would remain in the middle, untouched, until Clara found a way to move the weight without letting it fall on the child's small shoulders. Evelyn arrived on a Sunday afternoon, just as she always had. She carried a basket of fresh muffins wrapped in checkered cloth, her perfume preceding her into the house like a practice announcement. She called out Amelia's name in a sing-song tone, as though the world remained unchanged, as though her daughter's eyes had not caught her lips pressed against Daniel's only nights before. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a towel, and watched as Amelia rushed forward, hugging her grandmother with the unguarded trust only a child could give. The smile Evelyn wore was the same one Clara had seen her use at church socials and family gatherings. It was wide, confident, polished with decades of practice. Her lips curved just enough to suggest warmth, her eyes softened at the corners to feign sincerity. But to Clara, the smile no longer read as affection. It was a mask stretched across betrayal, hiding what had already been revealed in the shadows of the den. Clara studied it with the intensity of someone looking for cracks in a wall, waiting for the plaster to crumble and reveal what lay beneath. Evelyn moved about the house with ease, slipping into the rhythm of grandmotherly duties, as if nothing had been disturbed. She sat at the table with Amelia, helping her cut paper shapes for a school project. She leaned down to press a kiss to her granddaughter's forehead, the same lips that had betrayed a daughter's trust. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, noting every gesture, every casual touch of her mother's hand against Amelia's hair, every laugh that rang too loudly. She noticed the way Evelyn avoided her gaze, how her smile faltered only when she thought Clara wasn't looking. When they sat down for tea, Evelyn filled the silence with questions about Amelia's schoolwork, about Daniel's long hours at the office, about the weather turning colder. She spoke with the ease of someone who believed words could plaster over fractures. Clara answered with short replies, her tone even, her face calm, but inside her chest a storm churned. She kept her eyes fixed on her mother's movements, watching the way she lifted her cup, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way she smiled at Amelia with that same practiced ease. The performance was flawless to anyone who didn't know the truth, but Clara knew. She had seen the mask slip, had watched Evelyn's face soften in a way no mother should look at her son-in-law. And now, every gesture carried two meanings, the one intended for Amelia's innocent eyes, and the darker one Clara could never unsee. Later, when Daniel returned home and joined them at the table, Evelyn's smile widened, steady as ever. She greeted him with a warmth that might have seemed ordinary, but Clara caught the flicker in Daniel's eyes, the brief moment when he could not hold his wife's gaze. The air grew tight, suffocating. As Evelyn laughed at one of Amelia's jokes, the sound brittle under its practiced brightness. Clara said nothing. She let her silence stretch across the room, a quiet judgment heavier than any confrontation. She watched her mother smile and wondered how long it could last, how long Evelyn could keep wearing it before the weight of truth forced it to break. Until then, Clara would remember every curve of those lips, every false brightness in her eyes, storing away like evidence, one gesture at a time. The town had always been a place where people noticed. Neighbors knew when the postman was running late, when a new curtain appeared in the window, when a car lingered too long at the curb. It wasn't malice. It was simply the rhythm of small-town life, where silence carried as far as voices did. And though Clara had told no one what she had seen, though she had kept her words sealed behind tight lips, something in her bearing betrayed her. The change was too subtle for Amelia, too carefully hidden from Daniel and Evelyn. But the neighbors saw. They always did. At the grocery store, Mrs. Donnelly behind the counter looked a moment too long when Clara paid for bread and milk. Her hands moved steadily, but her eyes flicked toward the absence beside her, the space Daniel should have filled. She didn't ask, only gave a small, polite smile that faltered at the edges, and Clara felt the weight of a question that would never be spoken aloud. On the sidewalk outside the hardware store, she caught Mr. Lawson watching as she walked past, Amelia skipping ahead with her rabbit tucked under one arm. He tipped his cap, polite as always, but his gaze lingered, as though he sensed a shift in the air around her. Clara nodded back without slowing her pace. She felt the scrutiny like a hand at her back, nudging her forward into streets that no longer felt anonymous. At church the following Sunday, the pews filled with familiar faces, the air thick with hymns. Clara sat beside Amelia, hands folded, her ring heavy on her finger. Daniel slid into the space on her other side, his arm brushing hers, his smile thin. Evelyn arrived later, gliding into the pew across the aisle, her expression serene, her eyes fixed on the altar. When the congregation rose to sing, Clara felt the gazes prick at her like needles. Not direct, not accusing, just long enough, sharp enough, to remind her that people noticed. The whispers began in corners. At the bakery, two women leaned close over the glass case. Their voices hushed though their eyes followed Clara as she left with her loaf. At the gas station, men in worn caps paused mid-conversation when Daniel's name surfaced, their words clipped short as though afraid to say too much too soon. No one spoke directly to her, but the silence around her was no longer clean. It carried undertones, ripples that spread without sound. Clara bore it with the same composure she carried at home. She kept her back straight, her words polite, her smile measured. But each gaze, each half-stifled whisper pressed against her ribs until breathing felt like labor. It was not only her secret anymore, though no one could name it. Something had shifted, and the town had scented it the way dogs sense rain before clouds gather. Walking home one evening, Clara saw curtains twitch at the Grant house across the street. She imagined voices behind them, low and conspiratorial. Did you see how she looked at her mother? Did you notice how Daniel avoided her eyes? She told herself it was only imagination. But in a town like theirs, imagination was often just the first draft of truth. She stepped through her own front door, closing it quietly, shutting out the weight of their stares. Inside, Amelia's laughter still filled the air, a shield she clung to. But outside, the gazes multiplied, whispering questions Clara was not ready to answer. She knew the day would come when silence would no longer be enough, when the town's curiosity would demand a reckoning. For now, though, she carried the burden alone, every glance a reminder that her private wound was beginning to seep into public view. The envelope lay on the kitchen table, cream color with Evelyn's careful handwriting across the front. Clara had found it tucked into the mailbox that morning, wedged between a grocery flyer and the electric bill. She had recognized her mother's script immediately. The loops of C's and the delicate line of the T's, the handwriting that had once signed report cards and birthday cards with the same steady flourish. She had carried it inside without opening it, leaving it on the table as she poured Amelia's cereal and packed her school bag. But all through the morning routine, her eyes kept drifting back to it, the shape of the envelope looming larger than it had any right to. By mid-afternoon, she slid it open with the edge of a butter knife. Inside was a card embossed with faded roses, the kind her mother always favored. It was an invitation to Sunday dinner, written in Evelyn's neat, certain hand. A gathering of family, the note said, a tradition worth keeping, a chance to be together. Clara stared at the words until they blurred, her pulse drumming in her ears. Together. The word had never sounded so false. Daniel noticed the card when he came home, setting his briefcase on the counter with deliberate care. He reached for it as if it were any other piece of mail, as though the invitation carried no weight at all. "Your mother wants us there," he said simply, avoiding her eyes. "We should go. It'll be good for Amelia." Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Good for Amelia. He always found a way to thread their daughter into the conversation, to twist her presence into a shield. She wanted to ask him if he thought Amelia would benefit from watching her grandmother smile across the table, from seeing her parents sit side by side, while the memory of that kiss still burned between them. But Clara said nothing. Her silence had become her weapon, her protest. Later, Evelyn herself called, her voice bright on the line. She spoke of roast chicken and fresh bread, of Amelia's favorite lemon pie waiting for her. "It's been too long since we've all been together," she said. "Don't deprive your daughter of family, Clara. She needs this." The words slid easily from her mouth, smooth as if rehearsed. Clara held the receiver tight, listening to the hum of her mother's confidence. Evelyn never faltered, never hesitated. Her insistence was a command disguised as care. When the call ended, Clara returned to the table and looked at the card again. It lay open beside the salt shaker, as ordinary as a grocery list, yet her stomach turned at the sight of it. The thought of sitting at that long table, of hearing Daniel's laugh echo beside Evelyn's, made her throat constrict, but she knew there would be no avoiding it. In a town where neighbors already whispered, absence would speak louder than presence. To refuse would draw questions she wasn't ready to answer. That night, after Amelia had gone to bed, Clara sat alone in the kitchen, the cards still on the table. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall. She traced the embossed roses with her fingertip, feeling their raised edges against her skin. A family gathering, Evelyn had called it, a tradition worth keeping. But Clara knew traditions could rot from within, their roots hollowed until the surface cracked. Still, she would go, not for Evelyn, not for Daniel, but for Amelia, who would never understand why her mother refused an invitation written in roses. The morning of the gathering came gray and cool, clouds pressing low over the rooftops, as if even the sky disapproved of the day ahead. Clara rose before Amelia stirred, her body moving to familiar routines of breakfast and tidying with the precision of someone who needed order to keep herself from breaking. The kitchen gleamed by 8 o'clock, every dish washed and stacked, every counter wiped until it shone. It was not that the house needed to be spotless. It was that she needed to busy her hands, to occupy the hours before she would have to sit across from her mother and husband and pretend her world had not been split in two. Upstairs, she opened the wardrobe and surveyed her dresses. The collection was modest, a handful for work, a few for church, 2 she saved for holidays. Her hand paused on a navy blue dress with a simple collar, one she had worn countless times at gatherings much like this. It was neither new nor remarkable, but it was sturdy, its fabric still holding its shape after years of washing and pressing. She lifted it from its hanger, shaking it out with deliberate care. On the ironing board, she spread the dress flat, filling the iron with water, waiting for the hiss of steam. The sound rose like a kettle about to boil, filling the quiet bedroom. She pressed the hot metal to the fabric, guiding it along the seams with slow precision. Every crease smooth became a small act of control, every straightened fold a barrier against the chaos beneath her ribs. She worked the iron over the same section twice, then a third time, though the cloth had already surrendered to her will. It was not just a dress anymore, it was armor. She needed its weight against her skin, its crisp lines to hold her spine straight when she sat at the table. She ironed the sleeves again, watching the steam lift and vanish, imagining it carrying away the tremor of her thoughts. She lingered on the hem, pressing it firmly, as though flattening the fabric could flatten the storm inside her. Amelia padded into the room, rubbing her eyes, her hair tangled from sleep. "That one again?" she asked sleepily, pointing to the navy dress. Clara smiled faintly, setting the iron aside. "Yes, this one," she answered. "It's a good dress." Amelia accepted the reply easily, already distracted by her stuffed rabbit. She climbed onto the bed and began arranging its ears, humming softly to herself. Clara glanced at her daughter and let the sight steady her. If she had to endure this gathering, she would do it for Amelia's sake, to keep the child's world from splintering. When the dress was finally ready, she hung it carefully on the wardrobe door, running her hand down the fabric one last time. The lines were perfect, sharp enough to cut. She laid out Amelia's clothes next, smoothing the small sweater, folding socks neatly, as though by controlling these details, she could keep everything else from unraveling. The hours slipped by, each one filled with small preparations, polishing her shoes until the leather gleamed, pinning her hair into place with quiet discipline. By the time the clock struck noon, she felt wrapped not only in cloth but in resolve. The navy dress, ironed twice, would shield her. The calm face she rehearsed in the mirror would hold. She could sit across from them both and keep her silence, and in that silence she would not bend. Clara stood before the mirror longer than she had intended. The navy dress fit neatly, its seams holding her body in quiet discipline. Yet her reflection unsettled her. She had expected to see a woman prepared, someone composed, but what stared back was a stranger with weary eyes. The glass reflected every shadow, every fine line etched by sleepless nights, every trace of weight she had carried alone. She raised her chin slightly, testing how defiance might look, but the movement felt foreign, as though she were rehearsing for a role she had never wanted to play. Her fingers brushed the collar of the dress, smoothing fabric already perfect. A gesture meant less for the garment than for herself. She searched the face in the mirror, the soft waves of her hair pinned carefully, the gold band on her finger catching the light, the faint color she had pressed onto her lips. She wondered if anyone else would notice the tremor beneath the polish, the fracture hidden under press cloth and measured lines. Strength, she realized, had always been something she associated with silence. Her mother had taught her that. Keep your voice steady, your expression even, and the world will have no choice but to respect you. But that lesson rang differently now. What if silence was not strength but surrender? She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass, her own eyes looking back with questions she did not want to ask. Could strength be found in staying, in protecting Amelia's innocence by maintaining the appearance of family? Or was strength in leaving, in tearing the facade apart even if it left her daughter with scars? The woman in the mirror offered no answers. She only stared back, calm and unflinching, as though mocking Clara's hesitation. She tried to imagine how Evelyn might look into the same mirror, applying her lipstick, fixing her hair before walking into a room. Evelyn's strength had always been in her composure, in the way she could hold a smile so convincing no one dared question it. Clara had inherited that skill, but standing here now, she no longer knew if it was a gift or a curse. Did strength look like her mother's smile, polished and unbreakable, even as it concealed betrayal? Or did it look like something else, raw, unguarded, a face that refused to pretend? She lifted her hand, removed the ring once more, and set it on the dresser. Without it, her reflection shifted. She looked both incomplete and strangely freer, though the pale indentation on her finger betrayed its absence. She studied herself like that for a long time, wondering if this was who she truly was now, a woman untethered, marked by what she had endured but no longer bound. Then, slowly, she slid the ring back on, not out of love, not even out of loyalty, but because she needed it today as part of the armor. To walk into Evelyn's house without it would be to expose a wound, and she wasn't ready for them to see how deeply it bled. Her eyes lingered on her own face once more, and she asked the question she had been circling all morning. What does strength look like? Was it a steady voice at the table? A hand that did not tremble when it lifted a fork? A gaze that did not break when meeting Daniel's or Evelyn's across the meal? Or was strength the choice she had already made? The decision to go at all, to sit in the same room, to let them see her silent endurance? She stepped back from the mirror at last, her reflection still watching her. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing the skirt of the navy dress. She did not feel strong, not in the way the word suggested, but she knew she would walk into that gathering and hold herself together, because that, for now, was the only strength she could manage. And sometimes, she thought, even that was enough. The air outside was cool, sharper than it had been all week, and Clara pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders as she stepped out the front door. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching the houses into tall, distorted shapes that made the familiar street look foreign. She paused at the edge of the porch, Amelia's small hand tucked into hers, the navy dress falling stiff against her legs. Across the road, Evelyn's house glowed with warm lamplight, the windows alive with silhouettes moving about in preparation. From the outside, it looked welcoming, a place of comfort and tradition, but to Clara it felt like a fortress, its walls built of betrayal, its doors guarded by silence. Amelia tugged at her hand impatiently, humming to herself, unaware of the battlefield her mother saw in front of her. Clara forced a smile down at her daughter, smoothing a strand of hair from her face, then turned her eyes back to the street. Each step would carry her closer to that table, to Daniel's forced laughter and Evelyn's polished smile. She drew in a breath and stepped off the curb, her shoes striking the asphalt with a sound that echoed louder in her ears than it should have. The walk was short, just across the narrow street, but tonight it stretched before her like a long march. Each stride felt heavy, deliberate, as though she carried more than her body across the distance. She carried knowledge, memory, the indelible image of her mother and her husband together in the lamplight of the den. She carried the silence she had chosen, the ledger she had written, the question she asked of reflection only hours before. The pavement seemed to resist her, each step an effort against a force that wanted her to stop, to turn back. She noticed details she would not normally have seen, the crack in a road patched unevenly, the faint chalk drawings left by neighborhood children, the way the breeze rustled the hedge by Mrs. Donnelly's yard. They were fragments of ordinary life, evidence that the world outside her door went on unchanged, indifferent to the war she waged within herself. She envied that indifference. Halfway across, she lifted her eyes again to Evelyn's house. The curtains shifted slightly in the front window, and Clara wondered if someone was watching, waiting for her arrival. The thought made her shoulders stiffen. She did not want them to see hesitation in her stride, to sense the dread in her chest. So she straightened her back, held Amelia's hand firmly, and let her face settle into the calm mask she had practiced in the mirror. By the time she reached the other side, the house loomed directly before her. She could hear faint sounds now, voices, the clatter of dishes, the scrape of chairs being moved into place. It should have been familiar, comforting even, but to Clara it was a sound of enemy preparation, of a stage being set for a performance she was being forced to join. She paused at the gate, her heart thudding in her chest, Amelia swinging her arm beside her, blissfully unaware. Clara looked down at her daughter once more, at the small, trusting eyes that held no suspicion, no fear. She drew strength from that gaze, enough to push the gate open and walk up the path. Her shoes clicked softly against the stones, and with each step she told herself she could endure it. She would sit at that table. She would hold her silence. She would let them see her strength and composure. But every movement forward felt like advancing into hostile ground, every breath like one taken beneath a watchful sky. When she reached the door, the warm glow spilling from the windows bathed her face, though she felt none of its warmth. She lifted her hand to knock, hesitated for a heartbeat, then let her knuckles fall against the wood. The sound was quiet, but in her ears it was a signal of entry, the sound of crossing into enemy lines. The door opened to warmth and light, as though Clara were stepping into a holiday postcard. The smell of rosemary and butter drifted from the kitchen, carried by the soft hum of voices and the clatter of dishes being moved. Evelyn greeted them with a smile stretched wide, the same smile she had worn all her life at family gatherings, a smile that seemed almost rehearsed. She bent down to kiss Amelia's cheek and took her small hand with practiced ease, ushering her inside as though nothing had ever been fractured. Clara followed, her body stiff, her senses caught by the scene unfolding before her. The dining room had been prepared with care. The long oak table gleamed beneath a runner of deep burgundy fabric. Plates were already set in neat circles, white porcelain rimmed with silver. Crystal glasses caught the glow of the candles standing tall in brass holders, their flame steady, casting soft light that danced against the walls. At the far end, serving bowls waited, each covered with a lid to hold in steam. From the kitchen came the unmistakable scent of roast chicken crisping in the oven, the aroma rich and deliberate, meant to coax comfort, meant to disguise. Daniel stood near the sideboard, pouring water into glasses with precision that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. He glanced up briefly when Clara entered, his eyes flicking over her before darting away, his smile short-lived. His posture was relaxed, at least for Amelia's sake, but Clara could see the stiffness in his shoulders, the careful way he moved as though rehearsing the role of husband and father. She had seen that same posture in the den weeks before, only then it had been softened by intimacy, not taught with performance. Evelyn bustled from the kitchen, carrying a basket of rolls wrapped in linen. Her voice warm, her tone casual. She spoke of how golden the chicken had turned, how the pie was cooling on the sill, how lovely it was to have everyone together. Each word slid easily into the air. But beneath it, Clara heard the silence of what was not said, the thick unspoken truth pressing at the edges of the room. Evelyn placed a basket on the table, adjusted a fork that was already straight, and laughed lightly as though nothing had ever shifted. Amelia climbed into her chair, her legs swinging beneath the table, humming softly to herself. She unfolded her napkin carefully, imitating what she had seen adults do, her small hands precise with the task. She looked at the candles with wide eyes, enchanted, her innocence a shield that none of the others dared pierce. Clara sat beside her, smoothing the folds of her navy dress, her hands steady on the tablecloth. She took in every detail of the arrangement. The polished silverware, the bowls waiting to be uncovered, the chairs placed exactly as they always had been. It was a stage, perfectly set, the actors stepping into their roles as if nothing lurked behind the curtain. The longer she looked, the more perfection stifled her. The gleam of the silver knives seemed too sharp, the symmetry of the plates too precise, the candles too steady. It was as though the room itself were holding its breath, unwilling to tremble, determined to maintain its illusion of order. Clara sat motionless, her face calm, but inside she felt the air pressing down on her, thick with contradiction. Daniel pulled out her chair for her, his hand brushing the back lightly. "Sit," he murmured, almost too low to hear. She did, her body folding into the place prepared for her, though it felt like stepping into a trap laid carefully with china and linen. Evelyn moved to her own seat, her smile unwavering, her posture elegant. She spoke to Amelia about school, asked questions in that bright tone that carried no hesitation, no shame. The candles flickered slightly, but their flames held steady, the only movement in a room straining to appear untouched. Clara let her gaze travel across the table, past the food, past the candles, to the faces that surrounded her, her husband, her mother, her daughter. To anyone else, it was an ordinary family dinner, staged in comfort and tradition. To her, it was performance, a tableau of betrayal dressed in linen and light. She folded her napkin across her lap and kept her silence, the weight of it heavier than all the polished silver on the table. The clink of silver against porcelain was the only sound for a moment as everyone settled into their places. Evelyn moved with the ease of a hostess who had rehearsed every gesture in her mind, her hands never pausing as she uncovered the bowls, steam rising like stage smoke. The roast was carried out with a flourish, its skin glistening beneath the dining room's warm light, the scent spreading thickly through the air. Daniel leaned forward to carve it, his expression intent, his movements practiced, his smile stretching across his face in a way that looked almost painful. Clara sat still, her hands folded on her lap, watching. Amelia giggled as she was given a roll, her joy innocent, bright, and entirely out of place among the strained movements of the adults around her. Evelyn reached for the wine bottle, her grip steady, her voice bright as she asked Daniel to pour. He obliged, tilting the bottle with careful precision, filling each glass in turn. His hands did not shake, but his smile was too wide, his eyes darting toward Clara and then away again. When all the glasses were filled, Evelyn lifted hers. The motion was fluid, almost regal, her smile holding perfectly in place. She spoke with a steadiness that betrayed nothing, as though the room were not thick with tension, as though she and her daughter had not been bound by silence since the night of the betrayal. "To family," she said, her voice ringing out with practiced warmth. "To traditions that bind us together through every season." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel lifted his glass immediately, his grin stretching a fraction wider, his eyes crinkling at the corners in an attempt at ease. "To family," he echoed, his tone a little too hearty, like a man performing for an audience he feared might not applaud. Amelia raised her glass of juice, her eyes wide and delighted, not catching the shadows in the room. "To family," she chirped, clinking gently against Evelyn's. Clara raised hers last. The stem of the glass was cool against her fingers, her movements measured, deliberate. She lifted it, but her lips did not curve, her eyes did not soften. She let the others' voices fill the silence while she merely touched her glass to theirs, the faint chime ringing louder in her ears than it should have. She did not speak the words. She let her silence be the missing note in their forced harmony. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward her, quick but sharp, before turning to Amelia with another warm smile. The toast moved on as though nothing had fractured. They sipped their wine, their juice, their rehearsed words hanging like a veil over the table. But Clara felt the falseness of it pressing down on her chest. The too wide smile on Daniel's face, the too steady tone of her mother's voice, the innocent joy of her daughter, all of it colliding against the silence she held in place like a blade. The glasses lowered. Forks moved again. Food was passed. Conversation resumed with careful ease. But the toast lingered, echoing in Clara's mind. "To family," Evelyn had said, her voice smooth as silk. "To family," Daniel had repeated, his grin sharp enough to cut. Clara sat among them, her own glass untouched, and wondered how long they could keep speaking those words as though they still meant anything at all. Amelia wriggled in her chair, restless while the adults' conversation droned on about weather and errands, about anything that filled the silence without touching what lay beneath it. She slipped down, her little shoes pattering across the wooden floor as she dashed into the living room. Evelyn called after her gently, her voice bright and measured, but Amelia didn't answer. A moment later she returned, clutching a piece of paper in one hand and a small box of crayons in the other. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, her eyes lit with the eagerness of a child who has something to share. "Look what I made," she announced, climbing back into her seat. She smoothed the wrinkled sheet across the table, right between the roast platter and the basket of rolls. The drawing sat there, bold and unmissable, its colors catching the glow of the candles. Crayon strokes had formed a house, uneven and lopsided, but recognizable. Above it a sun with orange rays smiled down, and in front of the house stood 4 figures, their hands almost touching. Clara's breath caught as her eyes followed the shapes. She recognized herself drawn in blue, Daniel beside her in brown, Evelyn in pink. Amelia herself was smaller, placed in the center, her stick arms stretched wide. But between Daniel and Evelyn, Amelia had drawn a jagged black line, thick and broken, as though she had pressed hard with the crayon until it nearly tore the paper. Daniel chuckled awkwardly, leaning closer. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched too high. He reached out a hand, but hesitated just short of touching the page. Evelyn's smile tightened as she glanced down at the drawing, her lips parting slightly before she forced them closed again. "What's the line, darling?" Evelyn asked, her tone careful, light, though her eyes flicked to Clara as if searching for answers. Amelia shrugged, stabbing a carrot on her plate with her fork. It's what I saw." Her words were simple, unadorned, as only a child could be. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. The drawing said more than enough. The table fell into silence. The candles flickered faintly, their flames bending as though the air itself had shifted. Clara stared at the black crayon line, the thickness of it, the jagged edges that cut between the 2 figures who betrayed her. Her daughter had noticed something. Maybe not everything. Certainly not the full weight of what Clara had witnessed, but enough to sense a fracture. Children always notice what adults tried hardest to hide. Clara reached across the table and laid her hand gently over Amelia's. "It's very good," she said softly, her voice steady. "You did well." She kept her eyes on her daughter, refusing to glance at Daniel or Evelyn. The silence that followed was heavier than the roast, heavier than the wine glasses resting half-empty around them. Amelia smiled, satisfied with her mother's approval, and went back to her food, humming under her breath. But the drawing remained on the table, its black lines stark against the bright colors, an unspoken truth laid bare by the hand of a child. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat, while Evelyn busied herself with pouring more wine, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she filled her glass. Clara let the moment settle. She didn't need to say anything. The drawing had already spoken for her. The innocence of crayons had captured what silence and pretense tried so hard to bury. And now, spread across the dinner table for all to see, the fracture could no longer be denied. The drawing lay untouched between plates, its colors vivid against the white linen, its black line darker than the shadows thrown by the candles. Amelia had returned to her food, humming softly as if nothing lingered in the air, but Clara felt the weight of it pressing down on everyone else. She reached for her water glass slowly, buying herself time, steadying the tremor in her hand. When she set it back on the table, her eyes lifted, not to her daughter, not to her plate, but across to Daniel. He was watching her already. Though the instant their gazes met, he flinched, his eyes darting down to the roast chicken as though suddenly fascinated by carving lines. His smile had collapsed, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching beneath his cheek. Clara studied him without speaking, letting the silence extend between them like a bridge he was unwilling to cross. He shifted again, adjusted the knife, and reached for the serving spoon with deliberate slowness. The avoidance was louder than any confession. Clara turned her gaze then, deliberate as a slow tide, to Evelyn. Her mother's head was bent toward Amelia, as if she were absorbed in the child's chatter about school, but Clara knew the feigned distraction for what it was. She waited patient, until Evelyn's eyes flicked up and landed on her. For a heartbeat, mother and daughter stared at one another across the candles. Evelyn's smile quivered, holding its shape with effort. But then, as though the air itself burned, she dropped her gaze to her glass of wine and swirled it absently, the liquid catching the candlelight in red arcs. Neither of them, neither Daniel nor Evelyn, could hold her eyes. That, Clara realized, was its own form of truth. Words were unnecessary. Their silence betrayed them more cleanly than any slip of the tongue. She sat back in her chair, her hands folded carefully in her lap, the mask of composure on her face unbroken. She wanted them to feel the weight of her watching, to understand that she saw them, that she would not pretend blindness. Amelia, oblivious, slid her drawing closer to her plate and colored a little sun in the corner with her orange crayon. The scrape of crayon on paper filled the space where Daniel's laugh should have been, where Evelyn's chatter usually spilled too easily. Clara allowed herself to breathe evenly, though inside her chest each breath felt sharp, as though pulled across glass. Daniel cleared his throat. "Amelia, that's a fine son you've made," he said, his voice too bright brittle. Evelyn reached for the rolls, offering one to Clara with a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. Clara accepted it with a polite nod, but her gaze lingered on her mother's face just long enough to remind her that nothing, not the food nor the candles nor the carefully arranged plates, could cover the fracture. The meal moved on, each course presented with Evelyn's steady hands. Each bite chewed in strained quiet, but Clara knew the balance had shifted. She had not shouted, had not accused, but in the glance across the table she had laid her judgment bare. They had looked away, and in that simple act, they had admitted everything. The meal had settled into a rhythm of clinking forks and the occasional murmur from Amelia, who narrated her own thoughts about the food in small, cheerful bursts. Evelyn filled the silences with questions about school and neighbors, her voice too steady, too careful. Daniel had eaten quickly, his eyes fixed on his plate, until finally, as though the quiet pressed too heavily against his chest, he leaned back and began to speak. "Do you all remember," he said, his tone pitched upward with false warmth, "that summer at the lake when Amelia was just a toddler? She tried to chase the ducks into water." He chuckled, forcing the sound, his smile stretched wide. She was running so fast her little feet he made a gesture with his hands, as though miming stumbling legs. And then, splash, right into the shallows. You couldn't even see her head for a second. Amelia giggled, remembering it differently perhaps, or simply amused at the image of herself falling into water. Evelyn laughed as well, her voice ringing bright, her eyes trained on Daniel as if willing his story to succeed, to smooth the atmosphere. Clara remained still, her fork resting neatly against her plate, her hands folded in her lap. Daniel glanced at her, expecting a laugh, a softened expression, some acknowledgement that the story had value. Instead, Clara's gaze held steady, her face composed, her silence intact. The air between them thickened. His words began to falter, his chuckle dying in his throat. And, well, Evelyn, your mother, she ran in to grab you before you swallowed half the lake. He tried to recover, to layer more amusement into his tone, but his voice betrayed him, catching in his throat. Clara's eyes did not shift. She remembered that day, remembered the ducks scattering, the splash of Amelia's small body, the way her heart had lurched until she saw her child safe again. But she also remembered the details Daniel left unsaid, the way he had stayed back, laughing too long before moving, how Evelyn had reached the water first. The memory was no longer innocent. It was now colored by all that followed, by the knowledge of hands and lips where they should never been. Daniel's smile flickered, faltered, and then collapsed entirely. His eyes dropped to his plate, his knife scraping against it too harshly as he pretended to cut a piece of meat that no longer held his appetite. Evelyn rushed to fill the gap, her laughter stretching a little too long, her words tumbling quickly about how fearless Amelia had always been. She painted the story anew, smoothing its edges, but even her voice trembled under Clara's silence. Amelia, oblivious to the undercurrents, waved her fork cheerfully. "I remember the ducks," she said proudly. They looked scared. She laughed, bright and unaffected, and returned to her plate. Clara lifted her glass then, sipping slowly, her eyes never leaving Daniel's bowed head. He had tried to cast light into the room, to patch the fracture with nostalgia, but the story had stumbled. The weight of her silence had undone him more thoroughly than anger ever could. And in that moment, Clara understood that she no longer needed words. She only needed to remain steady, watching, letting the truth unravel them with nothing more than her refusal to play along. The roast had grown cold at its edges, though the center still gave off a faint steam. Plates were half filled with forgotten pieces, rolls broken apart but untouched, vegetables pushed to the side as conversation withered. It was Evelyn who finally rose, her movements deliberate, the hostess recovering her footing. She gathered the platter from the sideboard and set once more before Clara, the carving knife resting neatly along its edge. "Would you like to do the honors?" she asked, her tone too light, too smooth. Clara's hand moved almost without thought, her fingers curling around the handle. The weight of the knife surprised her, heavier than memory suggested, the metal cool against her palm. She lifted it slowly, the candlelight catching along its polished length. The room seemed to narrow in that moment, silence pressing in until even Amelia's small humming stilled. Daniel shifted in his chair, his fork clinking faintly against his plate. His eyes darted to the knife, then to Clara's face, then away again, as though the simple act of her holding it unsettled him. Evelyn's smile remained fixed, but her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening as she watched. Clara did not move at first. She stood with the knife poised above the roast, her breath measured, her expression calm. Yet inside, tension coiled tighter than any spring, running thicker than the gravy cooling in its bowl. This knife, this gesture of carving, was one she had performed countless times at family gatherings. It had always been a ritual of service, of dividing abundance into shares. Now it felt like something else entirely, a symbol of control, of power, of the unspoken edge she carried within her. Her eyes traveled across the table, lingering on Daniel. He pretended to busy himself with pouring more water, his movement stiff, careful, as though every drop mattered. She turned her gaze to Evelyn, who met it for a fraction of a second before lowering her eyes to her napkin, pretending to smooth its creases. Neither of them could face her fully. The silence deepened, thick as tar, until the only sound was the faint hiss of wax dripping from one of the candles. Clara pressed the knife into the roast at last. The skin cracked under the blade, the meat parting in tender slices, juices spilling onto the platter. The sound was soft, ordinary, yet in the charged quiet felt amplified, every cut deliberate, every movement echoing with unspoken meaning. She carved slowly, methodically, her hand steady. Each slice was placed carefully onto the serving plate, her composure unbroken. her silence as sharp as the knife itself. Amelia clapped her hands lightly, pleased with the renewed attention to the meal. "More for me," she chirped, unaware of the undercurrents. Clara offered her daughter a slice, placing it gently on her plate, her hand lingering briefly on the small shoulder beside her. That simple act grounded her, reminded her that her strength lay not in outbursts but in steadiness. She resumed carving, the knife gliding with ease now, though the tension in the room did not lessen. Daniel cleared his throat once more, but did not speak. Evelyn sipped her wine, her hand trembling slightly, the glass clicking faintly against her teeth. The performance of family continued, but Clara could feel its seams loosening. When at last she set the knife down, the roast reduced in neat slices, she folded her hands in her lap and lifted her eyes once more. Neither Daniel nor Evelyn looked at her, yet both felt the weight of her presence, the authority in her silence. The knife rested harmlessly on the platter, but its paws had already cut deeper than its blade ever could. Clara rose from her chair with the same calm precision she had carried since stepping into the room. Conversation had dwindled to scattered fragments, Evelyn commenting on the crispness of the roast, Daniel asking Amelia if she wanted more juice. But the words rang hollow, brittle things tossed into a silence too heavy to hold them. Clara moved quietly, her footsteps deliberate as she left the table and walked into the hallway. The others exchanged quick glances in her absence. Evelyn's brows lifted faintly, as though she feared and expected what might come next. Daniel busied himself with refilling his glass, his hand unsteady enough that a few drops splashed onto the linen. Amelia, unaware, traced small circles on her drawing with her crayon, humming softly to herself. When Clara returned, she carried a small book bound in worn leather. Its corners were softened by years of use, the pages thick with notes and dates. It was her kitchen ledger, a book she had always kept at hand. She placed it on the table with a quiet finality, sliding it between the roast platter and Amelia's drawing. The candlelight fell across its cover, highlighting the creases, the faint stains of flour and broth that had gathered over years of ordinary life. Neither Daniel nor Evelyn spoke, their eyes fixed on the book as though it were something unfamiliar, though they had seen her write in it countless times. Clara pulled her chair closer and opened the ledger, flipping to the pages slowly, each turn deliberate. The scrawled notes of meals cooked, groceries bought, birthdays marked, all ordinary records of a household, passed beneath her fingers until she stopped on a page marked by a single date. Her fingertip rested there, pressed firmly against the ink. The date of the night she had walked into the den, the night she had seen shadows where none should have been. Her handwriting on that page was smaller, tighter, the words few but searing. She did not read them aloud. She only kept her finger there, her eyes calm but unyielding as she looked first at Daniel, then at Evelyn. Daniel shifted in his seat, his knuckles whitening where he gripped his fork. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Evelyn's smile faltered, the composure she had worn like armor cracking at its edges. Her gaze dropped to her glass, but the wine within it no longer seemed enough to mask a tremor in her hand. Amelia looked up, curious. "What's that page, Mama?" she asked, her voice clear and untroubled. Clara turned to her daughter, softening, and gently closed the book halfway, keeping the page marked with her hand. "Just a note I wanted to remember," she said. Amelia accepted the answer and bent back over her drawing, unconcerned. But the weight of the ledger remained. Clara did not need to explain. The simple act of placing it on the table, of marking that date in full view, was enough. The ledger had always been her private record, her witness. Tonight it became her testimony, a quiet declaration that she had not forgotten, that she would not allow memory to be erased by candles and roast chicken. The book sat there, small and unassuming, yet heavier than anything else on the table. The silence it summoned was deeper than all that had come before. Clara folded her hands once more and waited, her eyes steady. Daniel looked away first, his fork falling against his plate with a dull clink. Evelyn swallowed hard, her smile broken at last. Clara said nothing, but the ledger spoke for her, louder than words ever could. The ledger lay open on the table, its pages rippling faintly in the draft that slipped in from a window Evelyn had left cracked for the roast smoke. The room was still except for the muted crackle of candle flames and the faint sound of Amelia tapping her crayon against the edge of her plate. Clara's hand rested on the paper, her fingers pale but steady, pressing the spine flat as though to anchor herself. She did not rush. She let the silence stretch, let it weigh down on the room until every breath seemed too loud, every small shift of silver against porcelain too sharp. Daniel cleared his throat once, but when he realized the sound only drew attention to his unease, he stilled again. Evelyn sat rigid, her smile frozen in place, the corners of her lips twitching as though threatening to collapse. Clara drew in a slow breath and let her eyes travel across the ink. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, even, but each word struck like a hammer on stone. Daniel Whitmore, Evelyn Grant. Together, the syllables cut through the air with a weight that no one could ignore. The sound of her husband's name and her mother's name, side by side, written in her own hand, stripped the room bare of all pretense. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her tone was flat, unembellished, as if she were reading from a grocery list. Yet the meaning behind it hollowed the table of its false cheer. Amelia glanced up, confused, her small brow furrowed. "That's Daddy," she said innocently, pointing at Daniel with her fork. Then she turned to Evelyn, her eyes lighting with recognition. "And Grandma?" She smiled, not understanding, before returning to her drawing. Daniel's face flushed crimson. He shifted in his chair, his hand clenching the edge of the tablecloth. "Clara," he began, his voice strained, but she held up her hand, palm open, silencing him without looking his way. Evelyn's composure faltered at last. Her smile dissolved into a faint tightening of her lips, her eyes lowering to her lap. She reached for her wine glass, but her hand trembled, the liquid swirling dangerously near the rim. She set it back down without drinking. Clara repeated the words, softer this time, but no less sharp. Daniel Whitmore, Evelyn Grant. Together. She did not elaborate, did not accuse. The words themselves were enough. They marked the page, marked the air, and forced acknowledgement from those who had hidden behind silence and performance. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily, its rhythm intruding on the heavy quiet. Amelia hummed again, shading in the roof of her house with careful strokes of red. The innocence of her sound only deepened the fracture laid bare at the table. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low, almost pleading. "We don't need to do this here." His eyes flicked to Amelia, desperate, but Clara kept hers fixed on the ledger. She did not respond, did not argue. The names stood on their own, impossible to erase now that they had been spoken aloud. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice thin. "Clara, it isn't." She stopped herself, the words drying up before they could form into a lie. Her hands folded tightly in her lap, and she pressed her lips together until the silence reclaimed her. Clara closed the book gently, her hand firm against the cover. The sound of its shutting was final, heavier than any outburst could have been. The names had been read, the truth placed in the open where no candlelight, no roast, no toast could cover it again. She lifted her eyes at last, meeting Daniel's gaze, then Evelyn's, and this time neither of them could look away. The ledger's cover closed with a soft thud, but its echo carried through the room like the crack of a gavel. No one moved. The roast sat cooling in the center of the table, its juices congealing along the platter, a meal meant to comfort now left untouched. Forks, half lifted, hovered in the air, suspended between plates and mouths that no longer hungered. The silence was so sharp it seemed to slice through the warm glow of the candles, casting the scene in a strange, frozen tableau. Daniel's hand gripped his fork so tightly that his knuckles whitened, the tines glinting in the candlelight as though caught mid-strike. He looked at Clara, then quickly away, his jaw locked as though words threatened to claw their way out but could not find passage. Evelyn's fingers had stilled on her napkin, the linen bunched in her lap, her usual grace betrayed by the stiff curl of her hand. She sat upright, but her shoulders trembled beneath the careful composure of her posture. Amelia blinked, her wide eyes darting from one adult to another. She had never seen a table so still, never watched her family become statues around her. She tapped her fork lightly against her plate, The sound small but startling in the thick quiet. "Mama?" she whispered, her voice uncertain, but no one answered right away. The whispers had floated faintly from the kitchen. Evelyn humming earlier, the soft scrape of serving spoons. Were gone now. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The ticking clock in the hallway suddenly loud, each second stretching into something unbearable. Daniel set his fork down finally, the faint clink like glass shattering in a cathedral. He rubbed his hand against his thigh, staring at his plate as though the food might explain a way forward. Evelyn adjusted in her chair, her lips parting, ready to speak, but the words died as quickly as they formed. Her eyes flicked to Clara, met the unwavering calm in her daughter's face, and faltered. Amelia's voice rose again, small and puzzled. "Why did you say their names, Mama?" Her question hung in the air like smoke, innocent and piercing all at once. Clara turned to her daughter, her expression softening at the edges, though her silence remained. She reached out, brushing Amelia's hair back from her forehead, her hand steady even as the room quivered under the weight of truth. The candles dripped slowly, wax sliding down in pale trails, as though marking time for the family, who could no longer move forward. No one dared speak. Daniel shifted in his seat, but when he looked up, Clara's eyes met his and held him there until he looked away once more. Evelyn folded her napkin with deliberate slowness, her hands trembling against the fabric, trying to control something she could not. The family remained suspended, each of them caught in the fracture Clara had laid bare. Forks halted midair, whispers stilled. Even breaths came shallow and cautious. Only Amelia's confusion stirred the air, her small blinking eyes struggling to reconcile the warmth she expected with the cold silence she found instead. The moment stretched, elongated until it seemed it might last forever. A family gathered around a table, food cooling, candles burning low, names spoken aloud like a verdict none of them could escape. They were frozen there, bound by silence more unyielding than iron, each waiting for the other to move first, each afraid of what would come when the stillness finally broke. Evelyn had always been a woman of words. Her reputation in the neighborhood rested on her ability to glide through conversation, to soften an awkward silence with a laugh, to distract with a compliment or anecdote before anyone noticed a crack in her polished exterior. But at the long table, under the candlelight that revealed too much and softened nothing, her words stumbled at the threshold of her lips. Amelia's question still lingered, fragile and persistent. "Why did you say their names, Mama?" The child's voice had pierced the frozen air like a chime, sweet yet merciless. Daniel sat rigid, his fork abandoned, his gaze glued to his plate. Clara remained composed, her ledger closed but present, her silence a blade. And Evelyn, who had built her life on control, felt her mask slipping. Evelyn began, her voice thinner than usual, betraying a tremor she couldn't disguise. She cleared her throat and tried again, lifting her chin slightly as if posture might steady her. "What your mother meant, darling," she said to Amelia, her words careful, drawn out, "was nothing more than remembering how important family is. We sometimes write things down so we don't forget." Her smile wavered, the corners twitching as though held in place by sheer force. She reached for her glass, her fingers trembling against the stem. The wine swirled, catching the candlelight, but she didn't drink. Instead, she sat back down too quickly, the glass ringing faintly against the wood. Amelia blinked, unconvinced but quiet, turning her crayon in her fingers as if the child's world was still pliable, not yet hardened by betrayal. Clara kept her eyes on Evelyn, unblinking, her face as steady as stone. The silence that followed pressed Evelyn further, and she scrambled to fill it. "Clara has always kept careful notes," she said, her voice louder now, more forced. "It's her way of keeping order. You know how she is." She let out a brittle laugh, looking at Daniel for support, but he did not lift his eyes. His shoulders sagged, his silence condemning her more thoroughly than any accusation. Evelyn's carefully built image, the composed matriarch, the warm grandmother, the woman who smoothed every surface, began to crumble in her stammering. She tried to rebuild it with each word, to stitch together dignity from fraying threads, but Clara's silence cut through every attempt. "Family matters," Evelyn said finally, her tone dropping into something firmer, almost commanding. "That's what this dinner is about. That's what your mother was showing." She placed her hand over Amelia's small one, pressing too firmly, her desperation leaking through the gesture. That's all there is to it. But the cracks were visible now. Her excuses sounded hollow, her composure strained. The more she tried to insist on control, the more the room revealed how little of it she still possessed. Clara's ledger had already done the work of truth. Evelyn's stammering only underscored it. Clara did not respond. She let Evelyn's words hang, let them fail under their own weight. She knew her mother's voice better than anyone, knew when the confidence was genuine and when it was patched together in haste. Tonight, the patchwork showed. The family remained at the table, food cooling, candles burning low. Evelyn's mask was cracking, her excuses spilling out in fragments. And Clara, silent and steady, understood that sometimes the sharpest blow was not delivered in anger, but in refusing to join the performance at all. Daniel sat with his shoulders rounded, the fork abandoned at the edge of his plate, his glass of water untouched. The room was heavy with Evelyn's excuses, her words still echoing in the air like a song off-key, but Daniel did not reach for them, did not add his voice to her faltering defense. His head bowed, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth as though the woven fabric might offer him shelter. Clara's eyes stayed on him. She did not blink, did not flinch, only watched. In all the years of their marriage, she had known his expressions. The smirk he wore when joking, the softened look he gave Amelia at bedtime, the furrow in his brow when bills piled high. But this expression was different. It was neither contrition nor courage. It was a collapse. His silence was not noble. It was hollow. Amelia shifted in her seat, puzzled by the stillness that had settled on her father. She leaned forward slightly, as though waiting for him to tell another story, to bring the room back to the easy rhythm of before. But Daniel did not move. His hands remained in his lap, clenched loosely, his posture that of a man who knew the performance was over. Evelyn glanced at him, her eyes sharp with unspoken commands. She wanted him to speak, to patch the crack Clara had widened by reading from the ledger. But Daniel gave her nothing. His shame was too thick, clinging to him like a second skin. He could not lift his head to meet Clara's gaze, could not offer even a pretense of denial. Clara let the silence lengthen, her steady presence pressing down on him. She remembered the first night she had seen him laugh at her mother's joke, remembered how easily he had drawn her into trust years ago, remembered every shared promise they had once whispered in the dark. All of it seemed far away now, dissolved into the bowed figure before her. The candles burned lower, their wax dripping steadily into small pools at the base of the holders. The faint hiss of the roast settling on the platter filled the gaps between breaths. Still Daniel said nothing. He swallowed once, his throat working visibly, but the words never came. His shame spoke louder than excuses could have. Amelia finally broke the quiet, her young voice uncertain. "Daddy?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Are you sick?" It was the only explanation she could reach for, watching him shrink into himself. Daniel forced a faint smile, but it was brittle, vanishing before it reached his eyes. He shook his head slightly, still unable to answer. Clara reached across the table, resting her hand gently on Amelia's, keeping her daughter from asking again. She kept her gaze on Daniel, steady and unrelenting. He felt it. She could see the way his shoulders tensed, the way his jaw tightened, but he would not look up. His silence was a confession, his bowed head the only admission he seemed capable of offering. Evelyn tried once more, her voice pitched high with strain. "Clara, this doesn't—" But Clara raised her hand, silencing her without a word. She wanted Daniel to speak, to fill the air with something more than his shame, but she knew he wouldn't. He had chosen silence, and in that silence he revealed everything. The family sat suspended in the glow of fading candles, forks untouched, breaths shallow. Daniel offered no defense, only his bowed head, and in that moment Clara understood that sometimes shame itself was the truest verdict. Amelia had been quiet for longer than usual. She was a child who filled silence with humming, with chatter about school or the shape of clouds, with questions that spilled out as naturally as breath. But now she sat still, her crayon resting idle beside her drawing, her fork untouched on the rim of her plate. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, moved slowly between the adults at the table. First to her father, bowed and silent, then to her grandmother, whose smile had fractured into a thin, trembling line. Finally to her mother, calm and steady, the ledger closed but present like a shadow on the table. No words came from Amelia, but her gaze was heavier than any spoken question. She looked at Daniel with a searching expression, her head tilted slightly as if trying to reconcile the man who tucked her in at night with the figure slumped before her now. She looked at Evelyn, studying the hands folded too tightly in her lap, the lipstick smile that no longer convinced anyone. And then she looked at Clara, her eyes soft but uncertain, as though seeking permission to believe what her heart already understood. Children often notice what was hidden in plain sight. Amelia didn't need names spoken again, didn't need an explanation she was too young to fully comprehend. The shift in the room was enough. The absence of her father's voice, the stammer in her grandmother's, the unwavering calm of her mother, all of it formed a truth her young mind could piece together. She blinked once, slowly, as though marking the moment, then kept staring. Daniel felt it first, the weight of his daughter's eyes pressing into him more painfully than Clara's silence. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, but when he looked up, Amelia's gaze met his without flinching. There was no accusation in her face, only confusion mixed with a dawning awareness. He dropped his eyes again, unable to hold her innocence against his shame. Evelyn fared no better. She tried to smile, to soften her features, but Amelia's stare pierced through every practiced gesture. The child's eyes lingered on her for a long moment, steady and unblinking, until Evelyn turned slightly in her chair, pretending to adjust the serving dish beside her. It was a small surrender, but one that revealed more than words ever could. Clara remained still, her gaze on her daughter now. She saw the recognition settling in Amelia's eyes, the quiet comprehension that children carried when they understood more than adults expected. Clara felt her heart ache at the sight, the innocence of crayons and drawings colliding with truths too heavy for small shoulders. Yet she did not intervene. She let Amelia look, let her see what silence and ledger entries had already exposed. The room grew unbearably quiet again, the ticking clock louder than breath, the drip of candle wax marking time. Amelia's eyes moved once more between them, circling the triangle of betrayal and silence, then settling back on her mother. She didn't ask anything. She didn't need to. Her understanding hung in the air, fragile and devastating. Clara reached out, smoothing a hand over Amelia's hair, her touch gentle, her expression unchanged. In that gesture was both comfort and acknowledgement. The child's eyes had already seen enough. Words would only bruise what she already knew. The family sat bound in that gaze, each adult exposed by the unspoken truth reflected in a child's steady stare. No more excuses could cover it. No silence could hide it. Amelia's eyes had drawn the lines more clearly than Clara's ledger ever could. Clara rose without a word. The chair's legs scraped softly against the floor, a sound so ordinary it might have passed unnoticed on any other night, but in that room it rang louder than any outburst. The long table, still set with untouched dishes and fading candles, seemed to shrink in her periphery as she straightened to her full height. Her hands were steady, her breath measured. She reached for Amelia with quiet certainty, brushing her daughter's hair back as she lifted the small girl's hand into her own. Amelia didn't resist. She looked once more at her father, then at her grandmother, her wide eyes filled with the kind of knowing silence only children carried. She rose from her chair obediently, her crayon and drawing left behind on the table, their colors and broken line abandoned among the cooling roast and half-filled glasses. Clara smoothed Amelia's dress, tugged her close, and turned toward the door. Daniel shifted as if to rise. His mouth opened, but no words came. His hand lifted slightly from the table, hovering above the linen as though he might reach out, but he let it fall back to his side. He could not form a plea, could not gather the strength to stop them. His shame anchored him to his chair, leaving him to watch as his wife and daughter turned away. Evelyn's lips parted too, her voice catching on a faint whisper of Clara's name. She reached forward, her hand brushing the air in a gesture that looked more like habit than sincerity. But Clara didn't turn. She kept her gaze forward, her steps firm, her daughter's small shoes tapping softly in time beside her own. Evelyn's hand lingered uselessly in the space between them, her carefully built image crumbling in the silence. The candles hissed faintly, a drop of wax falling onto the table runner. The only sound after Clara's departure began. The ledger lay closed on the wood, heavy with its secret, its date marked like a scar that would not fade. Clara glanced at it once as she passed, but she did not reach for it. It could remain there, among the ruins of what had been said. Her truth had already been spoken. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the air cooler, but Clara walked it with unflinching steps. Amelia clutched her hand tighter as they reached the door, her small face tilted upward in quiet trust. Clara opened it and let the night air rush in, sharp and clean compared to the suffocating stillness of the dining room. Behind her, she heard nothing. No protest, no footsteps following, only the brittle silence of two people left behind with their guilt. She stepped onto the porch, guiding Amelia down the steps, her hand gentle but firm. The street stretched before them, shadowed and familiar, and for the first time in what felt like months, Clara could breathe without the weight of a house pressing down on her. She did not look back, not at the windows glowing dimly with candlelight, not at the table where her family had unraveled in silence, not at the faces too weak to face her. She walked forward, her daughter's hand warm in her own, leaving behind the ledger, the roast, the wine, the excuses. Each step carried her farther from betrayal and closer to something she did not yet have words for. The door closed behind her with a sound that seemed final, though she hadn't bothered to shut herself. The house would hold its secrets without her. The walkout was not hurried, not dramatic. It was deliberate, each step steady, as though the path had been laid for her long before she ever stood from that chair. The house greeted her with stillness. Clara closed the door softly behind her, the faint clicks sounding louder than the voices she had left behind. She let Amelia's hand slip from her own, watching her daughter pad down the hallway toward her room, her small feet brushing across the rug. No questions came, no protests, only a child's instinct to retreat into sleep, to trust that her mother's silence meant safety. Clara stood in the dim light of the entryway, her shawl still draped around her shoulders, her breath slow and measured. The kitchen smelled faintly of the stew she had simmered earlier in the day, a contrast to the rich roast she had walked away from. She stepped inside, switched on the small lamp by the counter, and set the ledger down. The worn cover looked ordinary again, unremarkable, its corners softened by years of use. Yet tonight it seemed heavier, as though it had absorbed everything spoken and unspoken around that long table. Clara ran her hand across it once, her fingertips grazing the indentations left by her pen. She opened it, flipping briefly to the page she had revealed, the date stark against the margin. She read the words again, Daniel Whitmore, Evelyn Grant, together, then closed it firmly. The sound was quiet, final, but more decisive than any shouting could have been. She carried the book to the shelf by the pantry, where it had always lived among recipe cards and grocery lists, tucked between cookbooks she seldom used. Sliding it back into place felt like sealing something away, not forgotten, but no longer needing to sit in the open. The ledger was her witness, her record, her truth. It did not need to be brandished again. It had done its work. Clara lingered by the counter, her hand resting on the wood. She thought of Daniel's bowed head, of Evelyn's stammering voice, of Amelia's wide eyes that saw too much. She thought of the plates left unfinished, the candles burning low, the silence that had thickened until even breathing it felt like betrayal. She had walked out without raising her voice, without accusation, without spectacle. That was her choice. To let silence carry the weight that words would only scatter. The clock in her own hallway ticked steadily, a rhythm more familiar, more forgiving than the one in Evelyn's dining room. She found herself listening to it, grounding herself in the simple march of seconds. She moved to Amelia's room, pausing in the doorway. Her daughter had climbed into bed, the crayon drawing folded loosely on her nightstand. In the glow of the small lamp, Clara saw the black line again, jagged between the figures, bold against the bright colors. She bent down, kissed her daughter's forehead, and tucked the blanket higher around her shoulders. Amelia stirred, eyes half closed, but did not speak. The trust in that silence was enough. Back in the kitchen, Clara poured herself a glass of water and sat at the table alone. The navy dress she wore still held its iron creases, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like skin, worn and tested but unbroken. She sat quietly, her hands folded around the glass, and let the quiet surround her. She had made her choice when she rose from that table, when she left the ledger behind as evidence and carried her daughter home. There would be no confrontation, no shouting across rooms, only silence, deliberate and heavy, sharper than any accusation. The house of quiet closed around her, steady and certain. It was not the end of pain, nor the end of betrayal, but it was the beginning of something she could live with, her own truth, her own strength, her own decision not to play the role set before her. The ledger was shelved, the candles extinguished, the long table left behind. Clara's silence remained, louder than words, louder than shouting, louder than all the excuses left unspoken. It was her answer, final and clear.